Do you truly grasp the realities of medieval life for women? Do you believe the stories that paint them as powerless, silent figures tucked away in some forgotten corner of history? Prepare to have your perceptions challenged about women's power in medieval households from the 5th to the 15th centuries. Number 10. The lie that women were entirely confined to the home and had no public role. The popular imagination often pictures medieval women as strictly domestic figures, their lives revolving solely around the household, their world bounded by the walls of their dwelling. This is a persistent misconception, one that overlooks the vibrant, varied, and often public roles women played across the social spectrum in the medieval period. While certainly the household was a primary sphere of activity for most women, it was not a prison, nor was it their sole domain. Many women, both rich and poor, engaged in activities that extended far beyond the immediate confines of their domestic space, demonstrating considerable influence and agency in the public arena. Consider the noblewoman. Her household was not just a home, it was a complex administrative and economic unit, often encompassing vast estates, numerous tenants, and a large retinue of servants and retainers. When her husband was away, whether fighting in wars, attending court, or traveling on diplomatic missions, the lady of the castle or manor house often assumed full administrative control. She was responsible for managing the finances, overseeing the agricultural output of the lands, ensuring the collection of rents and dues, and even administering justice within her husband's feudal jurisdiction. Records from the Duchy of Burgundy, for instance, detail instances where noble women like Margaret of Flanders routinely managed their family's extensive territories and even negotiated treaties in their husband's absence during the 14th century. This was not a passive role, but an active, hands-on engagement with political, economic, and legal matters, demanding sharp intellect, strong leadership skills, and a clear understanding of feudal law and custom. They presided over manorial courts, heard petitions from tenants, and issued legal directives, effectively acting as local rulers. The legal treatise The Customs of Beauvaisis by Philippe de Beaumanoir from the late 13th century describes how women could indeed represent their husbands in legal proceedings and manage their affairs. Urban women also defied the notion of being confined. In burgeoning medieval towns, women were integral to the bustling economic life. Many worked alongside their husbands in trades, effectively running businesses as partners. In other cases, they established and managed their own enterprises. Women were active in a wide array of crafts and trades, from brewing ale and baking bread to weaving textiles and selling goods in the market. Their guild records from cities like Paris, London, and Cologne show numerous female members, some even holding positions of leadership within their respective guilds. For example, Parisian guild statutes from the 13th and 14th centuries indicate that women could be masters in trades such as silk weaving, embroidering, and brewing. They employed apprentices, hired journeymen, and managed workshops, demonstrating a significant public presence in the commercial sphere. These women were not merely helping, they were primary economic actors, often negotiating prices, arranging supply chains, and dealing directly with customers, all of which required navigating the public spaces of markets, shops, and trade fairs. Furthermore, women engaged in large-scale mercantile activities. Merchant women, particularly widows who inherited their husbands' businesses, could become powerful figures in their own right. They traded goods across long distances, managed shipping, and engaged in complex financial transactions. The letters of Agnes Paston, a 15th century English gentrywoman, reveal her shrewd management of her family's estates and financial affairs, including legal disputes over land and debts, often in a public and assertive manner, which challenges any idea of quiet domesticity. These examples illustrate a clear public role in trade and commerce that extended beyond the household walls. Religious women, especially abbesses, wielded immense public and spiritual authority. Convents were not just places of secluded prayer, they were often major landowners, economic engines, and centers of learning and patronage. An abbess managed vast estates, overseeing tenants, agricultural production, and financial assets, much like a secular lord. She often held feudal rights and responsibilities, including sitting in ecclesiastical courts and even commanding military levies from her lands. The Abbess of Quedlinburg in Germany, for instance, held imperial immediacy, meaning she answered directly to the Holy Roman Emperor and governed her own substantial territory as a sovereign princess. These powerful women engaged with secular rulers, bishops, and other powerful figures, making their influence profoundly public and political, stretching far beyond the walls of their abbey. They were not confined, they were leaders in every sense of the word. Even peasant women, while their lives were perhaps more physically constrained by the demands of agricultural labor and household production, still had public roles. They worked in the fields alongside men, brought produce to market, and participated in village communal life. They were integral to the agricultural economy, contributing directly to the sustenance of the community and the payment of rents to the lord. Manorial court records show women participating in legal proceedings, bringing complaints, or defending themselves, which required their public presence and articulation of grievances. The distinction between private and public, as we understand it today, was often blurred in the medieval period, particularly for the vast majority of the population whose lives were intertwined with communal labor and village life. The idea that women were entirely confined to a private, domestic sphere is a modern projection onto a historical reality that was far more complex and dynamic. The evidence repeatedly demonstrates that women across all social strata were active participants in the economic, legal, and social fabric of their communities, often with significant public responsibilities and influence. Number 9. The lie that women had no economic power or control over property. Another pervasive misconception is that medieval women were entirely bereft of economic power, possessing no control over property or wealth. This idea is a simplification that ignores a complex reality where women, under various legal and customary frameworks, held significant economic clout and proprietary rights. While legal systems varied greatly across different regions and time periods of the medieval era, numerous examples demonstrate that women could, and often did, own, inherit, manage, and even dispose of property, accumulating considerable personal wealth. One of the most significant legal protections for women's economic interests was the concept of dower. Upon marriage, a wife was typically entitled to a portion of her husband's land or property for her lifetime should she outlive him. This dower, often 1/3 of his holdings, was legally protected and could not be alienated by the husband without his wife's consent. When widowed, this dower provided a secure income and a base of operations, granting the woman substantial economic independence. For example, in England, Magna Carta, often seen as a landmark document for male liberties, also included clauses protecting a widow's dower rights, stating she could remain in her husband's house for 40 days after his death and receive her dower without delay. This ensured that widows, who often had to raise children and maintain households, had a legal claim to support, preventing them from becoming destitute. The value of this dower could be immense, particularly for noble women, allowing them to manage large estates, employ staff, and maintain a social standing independently of their deceased husband's family. Our court roles from various English manors consistently show widows managing dower lands, leasing them out, and participating in agricultural production, underscoring their active role in the economy. Beyond dower, women could inherit property, especially in the absence of male heirs. While primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son was common, if there were no sons, daughters could inherit equally as co-parceners, or a sole daughter could inherit an entire estate, becoming a sole heiress and heiress in her own right. Such women often brought vast lands and wealth into a marriage, making them highly desirable matches and giving them considerable bargaining power. The power of an heiress was such that her husband, in many legal systems, gained control over her property only for the duration of the marriage, not outright ownership. Her property often reverted to her family line upon her death, or was preserved for her children. For example, Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest women of her age, inherited the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in her own right, which gave her immense political and economic leverage in her marriages to the King of France and later the King of England. Her wealth was foundational to her power, demonstrating how inherited property could be a source of immense female economic influence. Women also retained control over their dowry, the property or money brought by the bride's family into the marriage. While the husband typically managed the dowry during the marriage, it was generally considered the wife's property and was intended to provide for her and her children. In some legal systems, particularly those influenced by Roman law, a woman maintained more direct control over her dowry and could even dispose of it herself. In many cases, marriage contracts explicitly detailed the management and return of the dowry if the marriage ended due to death or annulment. These contracts were not just about land. They could include money, goods, and other assets, providing women with a tangible economic base. Some records from Italian city-states, like Florence, reveal sophisticated dowry agreements, with women often bringing significant capital that was then invested or used to support the family's business ventures, demonstrating their foundational role in family finances. Furthermore, women actively participated in land transactions and other economic activities. Charters from across medieval Europe show women granting land, selling property, purchasing estates, and engaging in financial loans. These were not just nominal acts, they reflect real economic decisions and legal capabilities. For instance, a number of 12th century charters from France show women making endowments to monasteries, indicating their control over sufficient wealth to be patrons. The urban women, as discussed earlier, managed shops, ran craft workshops, and engaged in trade. The profits from these ventures were their own, allowing them to build wealth and influence. Guild regulations in many towns specified that widows could continue their deceased husband's businesses, taking over the assets and management, which further solidified their economic power. The existence of female moneylenders and property developers, though less common, also suggests a range of economic activities beyond the traditional domestic sphere. The concept of separate property, while not universal, also existed in some forms. Some legal traditions allowed women to hold property separate from their husbands, particularly if it was acquired before marriage or explicitly designated as such. This gave women a degree of financial autonomy and control, enabling them to make independent economic decisions. Even within marriages, where the husband managed the family's assets, the wife often held the keys to the household finances, managing the day-to-day spending, inventories, and accounting. Household accounts, such as those kept by medieval noblewomen, show meticulous records of income and expenditure, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of financial management and control over significant resources. The idea that women had no economic power is thus a gross oversimplification. They were deeply embedded in the economic structures of their time, with varying but often substantial rights to property and wealth. Number 8. The lie that marriage was always about total male domination with no female agency. The popular image of medieval marriage often portrays a complete subjugation of women, where their agency was non-existent and their lives entirely dictated by their husbands. This narrative, while containing elements of truth about patriarchal societal structures, fails to capture the nuanced realities of medieval marital relationships and the avenues through which women asserted their agency. Marriage was a complex institution, influenced by religious doctrine, legal custom, and social practice, and within this complexity, women often found ways to exert influence, negotiate terms, and even experience forms of partnership. Firstly, marriage negotiations themselves often involve significant female agency, particularly among the elite. While parents certainly played a major role in arranging advantageous matches, the prospective bride, or at least her family acting on her behalf, had a voice in the negotiations. Dowry and jointure of the settlement made by the husband on his wife were crucial aspects of these discussions, and the bride's family would negotiate fiercely to secure the best terms for her financial security and social standing. The marriage contracts, meticulously drawn up, stipulated not only the property arrangements, but sometimes also specified conditions concerning the wife's rights, privileges, and even her future spiritual provisions. These contracts were not merely passive documents, they were the result of often protracted negotiations where the bride's interests were represented and protected. Legal records from medieval Flanders, for example, reveal that some women had the right to refuse a proposed marriage, though this was often a high-stakes decision and rarer in aristocratic circles where political alliances were paramount. Nevertheless, the very existence of such a right, however rarely exercised, points to a degree of individual agency. Once married, a woman's power within the household could be substantial. As discussed, she often managed the domestic economy, which for a noble household meant overseeing a vast staff, managing budgets, and ensuring the smooth running of what was essentially a small enterprise. This role required significant administrative skill, authority, and decision-making capabilities. Household account books, such as those from the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, Lady of Clare, in the early 14th century, show her active involvement in financial management, purchasing, and overseeing the welfare of her dependents. Her actions reveal a woman with considerable practical power over resources and personnel. This domestic authority translated into real influence over the daily lives of many people, including servants, children, and sometimes even the husband's retainers. Furthermore, mutual affection and partnership, while perhaps not the idealized romantic love of modern times, were certainly present in many medieval marriages. Correspondence between spouses often reveals a deep respect, collaboration, and even tenderness. The letters of Agnes Paston and her husband John Paston in 15th century England frequently discuss business, legal disputes, and family matters, treating each other as trusted partners and advisors. While John was undoubtedly the head of the household, Agnes's opinions and abilities were clearly valued and relied upon. Such letters challenge the notion of a purely one-sided power dynamic, showing a relationship built on practical cooperation and often genuine affection. The Church, while upholding patriarchal norms, also emphasized the importance of mutual consent in marriage and condemned marital abuse, providing a potential, though often difficult to access, avenue for women seeking redress. Ecclesiastical courts heard cases of separation due to cruelty, indicating that women could, in theory, seek relief from intolerable situations. Women also wielded influence through their roles as mothers and social connectors. They often played a crucial part in arranging their children's marriages, using their social networks and understanding of family dynamics to secure advantageous matches. This was a significant exercise of power, shaping the future of their lineage and consolidating family wealth and influence. Noblewomen frequently acted as political intermediaries, leveraging their familial connections to negotiate alliances, secure favors, or even mediate disputes between warring factions. Queens and high-ranking noblewomen often maintained their own courts and entourages, acting as patrons of arts and literature, attracting scholars and artists, and thereby fostering cultural development. Eleanor of Aquitaine's court at Poitiers is a famous example, a hub of culture and political intrigue, demonstrating how a powerful woman could shape her environment and influence society at large. Finally, women could find agency through their religious devotion. While marriage was the expected path, choosing a religious life, particularly entering a convent, allowed women to escape the constraints of marriage and potentially attain positions of significant power and intellectual pursuit, as seen with abbesses. This choice, while guided by piety, also represented a form of self-determination, a decision to chart a life path outside the patriarchal structure of secular marriage. The idea of total male domination in all medieval marriages is a simplistic portrayal that overlooks the multifaceted ways women asserted their agency, built partnerships, and wielded influence within and beyond their households. Story number 7. The lie that women were uneducated and illiterate. A prevalent misconception about medieval women is that they were universally uneducated and largely illiterate, confined to a world devoid of intellectual pursuits. This assumption often stems from a modern perspective that equates education solely with formal schooling or university attendance, institutions largely, though not exclusively, male-dominated in the medieval period. However, a deeper examination reveals a diverse landscape of female literacy and learning, ranging from practical skills to profound scholarship, challenging the notion of widespread ignorance. Among the aristocracy and wealthier merchant classes, female literacy was far from uncommon, especially from the high Middle Ages onwards. Noblewomen were frequently educated, often by tutors within their own households or in convents. This education typically included reading and writing, often in multiple languages such as Latin and French alongside their vernacular tongue. They learned arithmetic, music, and sometimes even subjects like history and philosophy. The purpose of this education was practical to enable them to manage complex households, administer estates in their husband's absence, write letters, and engage in social and political correspondence. For example, Christine de Pizan, a 14th century intellectual poet and philosopher, earned a living through her writing, demonstrating not only her exceptional literacy but also her ability to thrive in the male-dominated world of letters. Her works, like the Book of the City of Ladies, show a deep engagement with classical and contemporary philosophy, history, and theology, challenging prevailing misogynistic views. This level of scholarship was not unique to her, but her prolific output provides clear evidence of a highly educated woman. Convents were major centers of female learning and literacy. For women who entered religious life, particularly those from noble or wealthy families, convents offered opportunities for extensive education. Nuns studied Latin, engaged with theological texts, copied manuscripts, and sometimes even composed their own works. Figures, like Hrotsvita of Gandersheim, a 10th century Benedictine canoness, wrote Latin dramas and historical texts, becoming one of the earliest known female playwrights in the West. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, was a renowned polymath, composing music, writing on natural history and medicine, and producing theological treatises based on her mystical visions. Her works were widely circulated and respected, demonstrating a profound level of scholarship and literacy that extended far beyond the convent walls. These examples highlight that for many women, particularly those in religious orders, the medieval period provided environments where intellectual pursuits were not just permitted, but encouraged and celebrated. Even outside elite circles, practical literacy was more common than often assumed. In urban settings, daughters of merchants and artisans might learn to read and write to assist in family businesses. This functional literacy enabled them to keep accounts, write invoices, and manage correspondence related to trade. The existence of stationers who sold books and writing materials in medieval towns suggests a demand that went beyond the purely male, clerical, or academic population. While widespread universal literacy was not a feature of medieval society for either men or women, the assumption that women were systematically denied any form of education or basic literacy is an oversimplification. Many women, particularly those involved in commerce or administration, possessed the skills necessary to navigate their economic realities. Furthermore, while formal education for many women might have been limited, informal education within the household was significant. Girls learned skills essential for managing a household, which included practical arithmetic for managing provisions, knowledge of herbal remedies for basic health care, and often the ability to read psalters or prayer books for religious devotion. The ability to read religious texts was valued, and many women owned and used their own prayer books, some of which were beautifully illuminated. These private acts of reading demonstrate a form of literacy, even if it was not always accompanied by writing. The survival of numerous medieval manuscripts copied or illuminated by women, particularly in monastic settings, further underscores their literacy and artistic skill. The very act of copying texts required not only the ability to read, but also a high degree of precision and understanding. Therefore, the idea of medieval women as uniformly illiterate is a myth that overlooks the varied educational opportunities and intellectual capabilities that existed across different social strata and within different institutional frameworks during the Middle Ages. Women were not just passive recipients of knowledge, many were active participants in its preservation and creation. Number 6. The lie that women had no influence over their children's upbringing or future. The portrayal of medieval women as having minimal influence over their children's upbringing or future is another pervasive historical inaccuracy. While patriarchal norms dictated the ultimate authority of the father, mothers, particularly within the household, played a profound and often decisive role in shaping their children's early lives, education, and even their adult paths. Their influence, though sometimes operating behind the scenes, was an essential and powerful force in the medieval family structure. From infancy, the mother was the primary caregiver and educator. She oversaw the selection and management of wet nurses for infants, a critical decision given the high rates of infant mortality. She ensured the child's physical well-being, managing their diet, hygiene, and basic health care. As children grew, mothers were responsible for their early moral and religious instruction. They taught children basic prayers, stories from the Bible, and the fundamental tenets of Christian faith, shaping their moral compass from a tender age. Noble women, for instance, often directly supervised their children's tutors and governesses, ensuring their education aligned with family values and societal expectations. For example, accounts from the household of Elizabeth de Burgh indicate detailed expenditures for the clothing, food, and education of her children, showing her direct oversight of their care and upbringing. This direct involvement in the foundational stages of a child's development granted mothers immense influence over their children's early worldview and character formation. As children matured, mothers continued to exert significant influence, especially in the arrangement of marriages, which was a critical aspect of medieval life, determining social standing, economic security, and political alliances. While fathers initiated the negotiations, mothers often played a crucial, behind-the-scenes role in identifying suitable matches, assessing a prospective spouse's character, and evaluating the social and familial implications of the union. They used their social networks, knowledge of family histories, and understanding of the children's personalities to guide these vital decisions. Letters from families like the Pastons in 15th century England frequently show mothers actively engaged in the delicate and protracted process of negotiating their children's marriages, providing advice, expressing concerns, and advocating for their children's best interests. Agnes Paston, for instance, was heavily involved in securing good marriages for her daughters, often traveling to meet potential in-laws and assess circumstances, demonstrating her agency in these crucial life decisions. Mothers also influenced their children's careers and life choices, particularly for sons. A mother's connections and patronage could be instrumental in securing apprenticeships, positions in noble households, or entry into the church. For daughters, mothers guided them toward either marriage or religious life, often preparing them for the skills necessary for either path. For example, a mother might use her influence to place a son in the service of a powerful lord or to secure a position for a daughter in a prestigious convent, which offered opportunities for education and leadership. The example of powerful queens and noble women who acted as regents for their young sons demonstrates the ultimate extent of maternal influence. When a king or lord died leaving a minor heir, the queen mother or lady often stepped in to govern, guiding the young ruler's education and preparing him for his future responsibilities, effectively shaping the future of kingdoms and vast estates. And Blanche of Castile, mother of Louis IX of France, served as regent during his minority and wielded immense power, successfully defending the realm against rebellions and ensuring her son's stable ascension to the throne. Her influence was not merely personal but political and far-reaching. Furthermore, emotional bonds between mothers and children were strong, despite the historical distance. Letters, wills, and other personal documents often revealed deep affection and concern. A mother's advice was often sought and respected, even by adult children. These emotional ties provided another layer of influence, allowing mothers to guide and support their children throughout their lives, offering counsel and practical assistance. Wills frequently reveal mothers making specific provisions for their children, indicating continued care and planning for their future well-being and economic security. The idea that mothers were passive figures in their children's lives is a misrepresentation. They were active participants, educators, strategists, and emotional anchors, profoundly shaping the destinies of their offspring within the constraints of their social and legal environments. Their influence was often the bedrock upon which family fortunes and individual lives were built. Number 5, the lie that childbearing was the only valued role for women. While the capacity for childbearing was undoubtedly a highly valued and celebrated aspect of medieval womanhood, particularly for the continuation of family lineages and the inheritance of property, the notion that it was the only valued role for women is a gross oversimplification. Medieval society, diverse and complex, recognized and esteemed women for a wide array of contributions beyond their reproductive capabilities. Their roles as administrators, religious leaders, patrons, healers, and economic actors were not merely incidental, but were often crucial for the functioning of households, communities, and even kingdoms. For noblewomen, while bearing heirs was important, their administrative prowess was equally, if not more, crucial for the family's prosperity and survival. A noblewoman was expected to manage the vast household, which included hundreds of servants, large provisions, and complex logistical operations. She oversaw the budgeting, purchasing, storage of goods, and management of the family's estates in her husband's frequent absences. This role required sophisticated skills in accounting, personnel management, and sometimes even legal knowledge to deal with tenants and vassals. A woman who could efficiently manage her husband's properties, ensure economic stability, and maintain the family's social standing was highly valued, even if she did not produce many children, or if her children did not survive. The practical governance of estates could be more immediately impactful on a family's fortune than mere reproduction. Records detailing the meticulous accounts and correspondence of powerful women like Eleanor de Montfort, Countess of Leicester, illustrate their deep involvement in the fiscal and administrative health of their families. Beyond the domestic sphere, religious women found immense value and power outside the confines of motherhood. Abbesses, as discussed previously, held positions of immense authority, managing vast estates, overseeing spiritual communities, and often acting as feudal lords. Their value was derived from their administrative capacity, their spiritual leadership, and their intellectual contributions, not from their reproductive ability. Women who chose a life of religious devotion, even if not abbesses, were valued for their piety, their scholarship, and their contributions to the spiritual life of the community. Figures like Julian of Norwich, a 14th century mystic and author, gained immense respect and influence through their spiritual insights and writings, demonstrating a path to value and recognition entirely independent of childbearing. Their contemplative lives and intellectual output were highly regarded, challenging the idea that societal value was solely tied to biological reproduction. Women also gained significant value and recognition through their roles as patrons of the arts, literature, and religious institutions. Wealthy noblewomen often commissioned manuscripts, funded construction of churches and chapels, and supported poets, musicians, and scholars. This patronage was a demonstration of their power, wealth, and cultural sophistication, and it contributed significantly to the intellectual and artistic vibrancy of the medieval period. The contributions of women like Marie de France, one of the earliest known French female poets, who likely enjoyed aristocratic patronage, or women who commissioned elaborate illuminated manuscripts, show an appreciation for female cultural contributions that extended beyond the biological. This role as a cultural benefactor was a significant source of prestige and influence. Furthermore, women were valued as skilled healers and herbalists within their communities. Many women possessed extensive knowledge of medicinal plants and remedies passed down through generations. They served as primary healthcare providers for their families and communities, especially in rural areas where professional physicians were scarce. Their ability to heal the sick, assist in childbirth as midwives, and care for the vulnerable was a vital and respected contribution to society, directly addressing practical needs rather than just reproductive ones. Guild regulations for midwives and the occasional appearance of female healers in court records for practicing medicine indicate a recognized, if sometimes informal, profession. This practical skill, which saved lives and alleviated suffering, was undeniably a source of significant value within medieval society. Finally, women were crucial economic contributors in various trades, from brewing and baking to weaving and shopkeeping. Their labor and entrepreneurial skills were essential for the urban and rural economies. A woman who could run a successful business, manage a bustling market stall, or produce high-quality textiles was valued for her economic contribution and her industriousness, irrespective of her maternal status. The ability to generate income, manage resources, and contribute to the family's financial well-being was a recognized and highly esteemed attribute. The idea that women's value was exclusively defined by their ability to bear children ignores the multifaceted ways in which they contributed to the social, economic, religious, and cultural life of the medieval world, shaping their societies in countless significant ways. Number 4. The lie that women's health and medical care were entirely neglected or primitive. The belief that medieval women's health and medical care were universally neglected, primitive, or solely relegated to superstition is another common distortion of history. While medieval medicine certainly lacked the scientific understanding of modern times and access to advanced care was limited, particularly for the poor, women's health was not entirely ignored, and specific knowledge and practices existed to address their unique needs. Moreover, women themselves played a pivotal role as healers and providers of care, often operating outside the formal, male-dominated medical institutions. Midwifery stands out as a profession almost exclusively dominated by women throughout the medieval period. Midwives were highly skilled and respected practitioners, essential for the safe delivery of children in an era of high maternal and infant mortality. They possessed a vast body of practical knowledge accumulated over generations concerning childbirth, prenatal care, and postnatal recovery. They knew how to assist in difficult births, recognize complications, and provide immediate care for both mother and infant. Guilds for midwives existed in some European towns, regulating their practice and ensuring a standard of care. For example, in Paris, the Guild of Midwives in the 14th century had specific rules and training requirements, demonstrating a recognized and professionalized role. These women were not just attendants, they were medical practitioners specializing in a critical area of women's health, providing crucial care that saved lives and alleviated suffering, proving that a specific and valued form of women's health care existed. Beyond childbirth, women often served as the primary healers within their households and communities. They had extensive knowledge of herbal remedies passed down through oral tradition or through practical experience. They knew which plants could be used to treat various ailments, reduce pain, stop bleeding, or aid digestion. Herbals, medieval books detailing medicinal plants sometimes describe remedies specifically for women's complaints. Women prepared poultices, salves, and infusions, acting as informal doctors for their families and neighbors. This was not merely superstition. It was a practical application of empirical knowledge honed over centuries. Records sometimes show women being paid for their healing services or being brought to court for unauthorized practice, indicating that their medical activities were recognized by the wider community and legal system, even if sometimes contested. The existence of wise women or cunning folk in rural areas, who often offered a range of healing services, underscores the reliance on female knowledge in health matters. Access to formal medical care provided by university-trained physicians was primarily available to the wealthy elite, both men and women. For aristocratic women, physicians and surgeons were consulted for serious ailments, and their households often employed apothecaries to prepare medicines. While these physicians were overwhelmingly male, they did treat women's specific conditions. Medical texts from the period, such as those by Trotula of Salerno, who may have been a collection of works rather than a single author, but clearly reflects a tradition of female medical knowledge, address gynecological issues and women's diseases, indicating a scholarly interest in female health, even if sometimes influenced by inaccurate anatomical theories. The School of Salerno in Italy, one of the earliest medical schools in Europe, is famously associated with female practitioners and writers on women's health, further challenging the idea of universal neglect. Furthermore, religious women, particularly nuns, played a significant role in providing health care. Many convents maintained infirmaries offering care to their own sisters and sometimes to the wider community. Nuns often had access to medical texts and cultivated medicinal gardens, applying their knowledge to practical healing. Their work in caring for the sick and the poor represented a vital component of medieval healthcare, often focused on compassionate care and herbal remedies. The efforts of figures like Hildegard of Bingen, who wrote extensively on natural medicine and healing, further highlight the intellectual engagement of women with health and well-being. The picture of medieval women's health is not one of total neglect. While medical knowledge was limited by modern standards and differed greatly by social class, significant efforts were made to address women's specific health needs. Women themselves were often the primary providers of care, especially in childbirth and herbal medicine, demonstrating a practical and often effective system of care rooted in empirical knowledge and community support. The notion that women's health was simply ignored or left to fate is an oversimplification that fails to acknowledge the rich, if often informal, medical practices of the age. Number 3. The lie that women had no voice or legal recourse in society. The widespread belief that medieval women were entirely voiceless and lacked any legal recourse or standing in society is a gross oversimplification. While legal systems were undeniably patriarchal and varied widely across regions and time periods, medieval women were far from legally invisible. They could, and often did, engage with the legal system, possess rights, bring lawsuits, testify in court, and seek redress for grievances, demonstrating a significant degree of legal agency. One of the most clear indicators of women's legal standing was their ability to own and control property, as discussed earlier. This right often came with the correlative right to defend that property in court. Women, particularly widows and single women spinsters or women religious, frequently appeared in manorial court rolls, urban court records, and even royal courts as litigants, plaintiffs, and defendants. They sued for debts, defended their property rights against encroachment, brought cases concerning broken contracts, and even pursued legal action for assault or slander. For example, records from various English manorial courts in the 13th and 14th centuries show countless instances of women participating actively in legal proceedings, sometimes representing themselves or appointing attorneys. They paid fines, received damages, and were subject to the same legal processes as men. This direct engagement with the legal system proves they had a voice and a recognized legal personality. Widows, in particular, held a relatively strong legal position. Upon their husband's death, they regained legal independence and full control over their dower lands and any personal property they possessed. They could enter into contracts, manage businesses, bring and defend lawsuits, and act as guardians for their minor children. This independence often made them significant economic and social actors. For instance, the wills and court cases of numerous medieval widows demonstrate their ability to manage complex inheritances, pursue financial claims, and even negotiate political alliances for their families. A widow's legal status was a marked contrast to that of a married woman feme, covert in English common law, whose legal identity was largely subsumed under her husband's, though even then there were exceptions and protective measures. For married women, while legally considered covered by their husbands in many systems, still had avenues for legal recourse. In some urban areas, women could engage in business as feme sole a legal status for married women, allowing them to act as independent traders for business purposes, allowing them to sign contracts and incur debts in their own name. Ecclesiastical courts, which dealt with matters of marriage, morality, and wills, often provided women with a platform to seek justice. Women could petition these courts for annulments, separations due to cruelty or adultery, and to enforce spousal support. These courts often had more lenient rules regarding female testimony and provided an important avenue for women to voice grievances that might not have been addressed by secular courts. Cases heard in church courts frequently detail women's complaints about their husband's behavior, their demands for maintenance, and their efforts to protect their dowries, showing their ability to seek justice. Furthermore, women could petition rulers and other powerful figures for justice or favors. These petitions, addressed to kings, queens, or high-ranking nobles, allowed women to bypass local legal bottlenecks and appeal directly to higher authority. Many such petitions survive, revealing women seeking protection for their property, redress for injustices, or relief from unfair taxes. The fact that these petitions were considered and sometimes granted demonstrates that women's voices, particularly those of the elite, were heard in the highest echelons of power. Noble women also frequently acted as legal representatives for their husbands when they were absent, participating in court cases and negotiations, effectively exercising legal power on behalf of their families. Even within patriarchal legal frameworks, there were customary laws and local practices that afforded women specific rights and protections, such as the right to inherit property, the right to compensation for injuries, or even the right to self-defense. The idea of women being entirely voiceless or without legal standing is thus a simplification that ignores the numerous historical instances where women actively engaged with, navigated, and even leveraged the medieval legal system to protect their interests, assert their rights, and seek justice. Their legal agency, though constrained by gendered norms, was a real and demonstrable aspect of their lives. Number 2. The lie that women were universally oppressed and lacked personal agency. The narrative often presented about medieval women is one of uniform and pervasive oppression, where they lacked any meaningful personal agency or ability to shape their own lives. This view, while acknowledging the patriarchal nature of medieval society, paints an overly simplistic and monolithic picture that fails to capture the immense diversity of female experiences across different social classes, regions, and time periods. While constraints undoubtedly existed, women frequently found, asserted, and exercised agency in myriad ways, often within or by skillfully navigating the very systems that sought to limit them. Personal agency manifests in various forms, not solely through overt rebellion, but also through choices, negotiations, and strategic actions within existing frameworks. For many women, Religious life offered a profound avenue for agency and self-determination. Choosing to enter a convent was often a conscious decision to pursue a life of spiritual devotion, intellectual growth, and communal sisterhood, free from the obligations of marriage and childbearing. As discussed, abbesses wielded significant administrative and spiritual power, governing vast estates and influencing both religious and secular affairs. These women were not oppressed, but powerful leaders, making strategic decisions that affected hundreds, sometimes thousands of people. Their very choice of vocation and the authority they subsequently gained demonstrated a clear exercise of personal agency. The economic agency was another critical aspect of women's power. As noted previously, women were active participants in the medieval economy. Whether running shops, managing craft workshops, engaging in trade, or overseeing agricultural production, women made independent economic decisions, generated income, and managed resources. A successful female brewer in a medieval town who employed staff and owned property clearly exercised significant personal agency in her financial and professional life. The ability to earn a living, to accumulate wealth, and to control one's own economic destiny provided a tangible form of independence and agency, particularly for widows and single women. The court records and business documents of towns like Florence or London show numerous instances of women acting as independent economic actors, making choices about their investments, their inventory, and their workforce, all clear indicators of personal agency. Even within marriage, where a woman's legal identity was often subsumed, forms of agency were present. While arranged marriages were common, particularly among the elite, women often had some say, or their families negotiated fiercely on their behalf. Once married, their agency was expressed through their management of the household, their influence over children's lives, and their role as trusted partners in family affairs. The letters of medieval wives, as seen in the Passion correspondence, reveal women who were not just passive recipients of their husbands' directives, but active collaborators, advisors, and decision-makers in their own right, managing complex family business, defending family interests, and asserting their views. Their ability to manage resources, negotiate with servants, and run daily operations demonstrated agency within their primary domestic sphere. Women also found agency through patronage and cultural influence. Wealthy noblewomen actively supported artists, writers, and religious institutions, thereby shaping the cultural landscape and demonstrating their taste and power. By commissioning works, providing financial support, and fostering intellectual circles, women asserted their influence over artistic and literary production. For instance, Marie de Champagne, a 12th century French countess, was a significant patron of courtly literature, including works by Chrétien de Troyes, influencing the narratives and themes that defined a significant literary movement. This role as a cultural patron was a powerful expression of personal agency and social influence. Furthermore, women, particularly queens and high-ranking noblewomen, could exercise significant political agency. They acted as regents for minor sons, managed territories, conducted diplomacy, and even led military campaigns. Figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, Matilda of England, or Blanche of Castile were not merely symbolic figures, they were active political players who shaped the course of kingdoms through their strategic decisions, alliances, and governance. Their agency was not just personal, but had national or international implications. While women rarely held formal political office in their own right, their indirect influence through family connections and their roles as regents or advisors was immense and widely recognized. The experience of women in the medieval period was incredibly varied, depending on their social class, marital status, geographical location, and the specific historical moment. While legal and social structures often favored men, women consistently found ways to navigate these structures, assert their will, pursue their interests, and make meaningful choices about their lives. To paint them all with the brush of universal oppression, devoid of personal agency, is to ignore the rich and complex tapestry of their historical reality and the countless individual acts of strength, resilience, and self-determination. Number 1. The lie that the medieval period was a uniformly dark age for women with no progression. The pervasive belief that the entire medieval period, spanning roughly 1,000 years from the 5th to the 15th century, was a uniformly dark age for women, characterized by unceasing regression and oppression, is perhaps the most significant and misleading lie. This simplistic view overlooks the vast chronological, geographical, and social diversity of the era. The status, rights, and opportunities for women fluctuated significantly across these 10 centuries and varied dramatically from one region to another, making any blanket statement about their experience fundamentally inaccurate. In fact, some periods and places within the Middle Ages saw women exercising greater power and enjoying more extensive rights than in subsequent centuries, including parts of the early modern period. The early medieval period, following the collapse of the Roman Empire, paradoxically sometimes offered women more influence in certain contexts. Germanic customary laws, which blended with Roman legal traditions, often recognized women's rights to property, inheritance, and even their ability to participate in legal proceedings. For instance, in Merovingian and Carolingian Francia, roughly 6th to 9th centuries, queens and aristocratic women wielded considerable political and economic power. And queens, like Brunhilde and Fredegonde, were not just consorts, they were active political players, often engaging in fierce power struggles, commanding armies, and ruling during the minorities of their sons. They owned vast estates, issued charters, and participated in court politics, demonstrating a level of public authority that was later curtailed. These early medieval examples show that women could hold significant direct power, often exceeding what would be typical in later feudal periods where male line inheritance became more rigid. As feudalism developed and consolidated, particularly from the 11th century onwards, the legal and social status of women sometimes shifted, often with the rise of primogeniture inheritance by the eldest son becoming more entrenched, which could reduce daughters' inheritance rights compared to earlier eras. However, even within the feudal system, women found ways to maintain and exercise power. Noblewomen, as discussed, frequently managed estates, defended castles, and acted as regents, especially during the Crusades when their husbands were absent for prolonged periods. These women were crucial for the stability and economic viability of their families and lands. Their role was not static. It adapted to the changing political and military landscape. The legal and social protection of dower rights across much of medieval Europe also remained a crucial safeguard for women's economic independence, ensuring widows had a secure financial base. Urban centers, which grew significantly from the High Middle Ages 11th-13th centuries onwards, often provided new opportunities for women. As towns developed their own legal systems and guilds, women found niches in trades and commerce. In many guilds, female membership was common, and women could be masters in trades like brewing, baking, and silk production. They operated businesses independently, contributed to the urban economy, and often held property in their own right, particularly in southern Europe, influenced by Roman law, where a woman's dowry remained more firmly under her control. The economic vibrancy of medieval towns created environments where women's labor and entrepreneurship were essential and often recognized, challenging the idea of a universal decline in status. Furthermore, the influence of the church, while promoting certain gender hierarchies, also provided unique opportunities for women. The convents offered avenues for education, scholarship, and leadership that were not available to women in many secular contexts. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, composer, and mystic, achieved profound intellectual and spiritual authority that transcended gender. These women were not marginalized but celebrated figures whose contributions shaped theology, medicine, and art. The very existence of such powerful female spiritual leaders and intellectuals contradicts any notion of an unbroken dark age of female disempowerment. Legal traditions also differed significantly across Europe. While English common law often limited a married woman's legal identity feme covert, other legal systems, particularly those influenced by Roman law in parts of France, Italy, and Spain, afforded women greater control over their property and more independent legal standing. These regional variations mean that a woman's experience in, say, 12th century Florence could be vastly different from that of a woman in 12th century England, making any uniform statement about female status misleading. The later medieval period, particularly the 14th and 15th centuries, saw some re-emphasis on stricter gender roles, partly in response to social upheaval and the Black Death, but even then, women continued to adapt and find new forms of agency. The idea of the medieval period as a uniformly dark age for women is a simplistic historical generalization that ignores the complexity, regional variations, and chronological shifts in women's rights, power, and opportunities. Women navigated, resisted, and sometimes thrived within the prevailing social structures, demonstrating a remarkable resilience and adaptability. Their experiences were far from monolithic, defying any easy categorization into a single, unchanging narrative of oppression.